and this is the second episode of our Quick Thoughts series, in which we deal with a couple specific issues, in a very quick and easy to follow manner. In this episode, I want to deal with the concept. And you'll notice it from the title, Is God Safe? And this is, I'm not intentionally trying to be provocative here, but I think it's something that we've lost sight of here in the church and in modern, in particularly Western Christianity. I don't know so much about Africa or China, how they deal with this concept of God being safe or the holiness of God, but I know in especially contemporary worship in the contemporary church, this is something that I think we've broadly lost sight of. Um, there's in the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. There's a scene where the children have gone into Narnia, and they're traveling, I guess, to meet Aslan, who is the lion, the personification of Christ or God in Lewis's Narnia series, and they're sitting in the beaver family's dam. These animals can talk and are personified. And as the children are talking with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, they're talking about Aslan because they're, like I said, traveling to meet him. And at one point, I believe it's Lucy, asks Mr. Beaver whether Aslan is safe or not, because she hears all these tales of his greatness, and there's she can detect a very real sense of awe in the way the Beaver family is talking about Aslan. And so she asks Mr. Beaver, is he safe? And Mr. Beaver immediately replies, haven't you been listening to anything that we tell you? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. And I think that, really encapsulates very nicely. C.S. Lewis did a very nice job there of kind of encapsulating the biblical concept of God. And I think it's one that we've lost sight of. We've lost our sense, I think, of awe towards God. Not only awe in just the sense of how great He is. There's the famous hymn "How Great Thou Art," which is a marvelous hymn. I love it. I don't think I don't see, a lot of people losing sight of awe in the sense of, oh, this is the God that created everything. Most Christians are aware of that, or they should be. Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He spoke the world into existence. And so I don't think, in a sense, we've lost sight of his power, but what we've lost sight of, I think, is his majesty and his holiness. And the Bible talks specifically about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I've argued before that the word fear there isn't meant only as just terror, cowering in a corner from somebody that you're terrified of, but in a sense that is also what it means. The Old Testament in particular is replete with examples of God, of people being absolutely terrified of God because of his majesty and especially his holiness. When the Israelites are camped out on Mount Sinai, before Mount Sinai, and Moses is going to go up and get the Ten Commandments from God, they beg Moses to have God not speak to them anymore, because the sound of the thunder, I believe it was, and the lightning, and just the supernatural events and the violent natural events that were taking place on the mountain just terrified them. They were in terror of it. I think this is a healthy thing, but we've lost sight of it. When Moses went onto Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments, he asks if he can see God, and God tells him, if you saw me, you would die on the spot, but I will put you in the cleft of the rock and pass by so you see my backside. Basically, just a small glimpse of his glory. And when Moses comes down, his face is glowing for days. this is, I don't think that's not just an isolated example. There's two specific ones that I want to go over here, that really highlight, this idea that the majesty and the holiness of God is really something that is not safe at all for us. It's not an irrational. We shouldn't be afraid of it because it's some kind of irrational menace. That's not what I mean, but rather that it is so beyond us, and our sinfulness and our unworthiness of being in the presence of such incomprehensible holiness and majesty and justice and perfection and righteousness, is such that we should be have a very real sense of fear of, as Jonathan Edwards put it, falling into the hands, sinners in the hands of an angry God. We should have a very real sense of our unworthiness. In the book of Revelation talks about the angels that are in the presence of the Lord. Their wings, some of their wings cover their feet, because they're unworthy. I guess feet are a symbol of unworthiness, or of covering your feet is a symbol of reverence, I suppose. Some of the stuff I haven't studied as much as maybe others. When Moses goes to get the Ten Commandments, God is in the burning bush, and he says, "Take off your feet, for the ground upon which you walk is holy." I mean, I think we've lost sight of this. This very real sense of awe and coming into His presence. It's remarkable, because when you look at the contemporary worship scene, it is so incredibly centered on what we are comfortable with. God only judges the heart, and yet He doesn't judge the appearance. So I can walk into His presence looking like I just rolled out of bed. I haven't shaved. I'm wearing a Nirvana t-shirt, and my pants are torn to shreds. The same outfit I would wear going to shop at the mall at Hot Topic, or eat in the food court with my friends before I go into Starbucks. It's incredibly casual. What does that say about your concept, about how you feel about having a real reverence for God? Much of this, I hear people constantly just saying, God doesn't care about the outward appearance, but only judges the heart. But what your outward appearance says, what is going on in your heart. Now, I'm not saying that people that dress this way are all just evil people and don't care about what God thinks, but it says something about their concept, about the holiness of God. I think they've lost it. And again, if they would just take the time to read the Old Testament, I think that would debunk this concept of God does not care about the outward appearance of things. Two specific examples here, and I'm going to have to look down at my phone for them. So those of you watching the video, that's what I'm doing. I apologize, but I didn't memorize the entire articles. The first example is Uzzah. Why did God strike Uzzah dead for touching the Ark of the Covenant? The story of Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant is found in 2 Samuel 6, 1-7, and 1 Chronicles 13, 9-12. As the ark was being transported, the oxen pulling the cart that the ark was on stumbled, and a man named Uzzah took hold of the ark. God's anger burned against Uzzah, and He struck him down, and he died. Uzzah's punishment does appear to be extreme for what we might consider to be a good deed. However, these are the reasons why God took such severe action. And they list a couple different of the ceremonial laws that God gave, and specific instructions God gave for the transportation of the Ark of the Covenant, which is like His dwelling place in the center of the people. You had the tent, the tabernacle, as they moved through Canaan and the wilderness, and there was the Holy of Holies, I suppose, I believe, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And there were specific instructions for how you were to behave, who was allowed in there, how you dressed, how you acted, what you did, what you said. And if you violated any of these things, you were done. You were dead. You were struck dead on the spot. There was no discussion. There was no debate. God didn't say, well, your heart was in the right place. No, you were dead. As Uzzah is a perfect example. He touched something that we were told not to touch, and he was killed on the spot. God's holiness cannot abide unworthiness in its presence. That's why the ceremonial laws in the Old Testament were so strict. The rules for how the priests behaved and how they sacrificed, made atonement for the sins of the people of Israel in God's presence, were so strict that if anyone violated them, they were killed on the spot. Now, there's a very famous story or anecdote that likes to be that gets spread around the internet these days of how the priest would go into the Holy of Holies with a rope around his stomach, and the people would have hold of the rope so that if he did anything wrong in there, they knew they would have to pull his dead body out. I've heard that that's not true, but it's, it could be true very, very surely if you read the Old Testament. So the first example is Uzzah. Uzzah did what he thought was a good deed, but so is technically, in a sense, you could say his heart was in the right place, and yet he knew that you're not allowed to touch the ark. So at the same time, he was certainly violating a command, but there was no debate about it. There was no, well, your heart might be in the right place. No. Done, dead, on the spot. And that's because God's holiness cannot be compromised. The second example, let me just skip to it, is, and I'm sure you could guess it, any of you who know a little bit about this, is Nadab and Abihu, who are Aaron the Levite's sons. They were priests, I think the first order of priests that were instituted. But what happened with them is in Exodus 30 and I believe Leviticus 10, God outlines a proper sacrifice to him. Aaron, the chief priest, was to present all offerings representing himself and the people. Moses said to Aaron, and this is from Leviticus 9:7 of the NIV, which I'm not a big fan of the NIV, but bear with it. Come to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering and make atonement for yourself and the people. Sacrifice the offering that is for the people and make atonement for them as the Lord has commanded. And God would, that was the verse. Now, outside of the verse, this is actually from Wikipedia, which I would almost never read, but I think it sums it up nicely. God would send his own fire to consume the sacrifice as a sign of his presence. When Nadab and Abihu lit the offering in the censers themselves, their fire was profane, and thus God was not in it. They prepared an incense offering upon kindling of their own, not of the holy incense from the sacred bronze altar. This was seen as foreign or unholy fire, and some translations say they burned unauthorized fire, or unrecognized, I think one translation says, in God's presence. Aaron's sons spurned the command to wait for holy fire and offered incense with profane fire. Anyone who altered the sacrificial system assumed a prerogative belonging to God alone. And so God struck them dead on the spot. And it's interesting, too. Some people might say, well, this was so severe, or this is an extreme. And like what happened with Uzzah is an extreme punishment for what would seem to be a very trivial sin. But this, I think, is proof positive that there is, number one, no such thing as a trivial sin. And number two, in saying that these are extreme responses to what we think are trivial sins, I think this just highlights all the more, or makes all the more obvious, that we have a very shallow and incorrect view of the holiness of God and how desperately unworthy we are in the presence of his holiness, and that he cannot abide sin or unworthiness in the presence of his immediate holiness. And if you transgress that, the consequences are very obvious. The application today to this is that I think we need to really go over and reassess these most of our contemporary worship services, where we go through just giving God a hand. In the church that I'm visiting right now, our family is, at the end of a song or something, the pastor will come up, let's give the Lord a hand. Isn't he just great? And everyone's standing there clapping and whooping and hollering, just like Neil Young walked up onto the stage, or Elvis Presley just finished Jailhouse Blues or whatever, or Schoolhouse Rock. Whatever he's saying, it's just this total lack of awe and reverence. They think that they're responding to in awe and reverence, but the casualness of the response, and the lack of awe in the response of just standing there, let's give the Lord a hand, tells me that they really don't understand what awe and fear and trembling and the fear of the Lord really is. So, in short, to surmise, I think this is something we really need to reevaluate. And it's not a trivial thing. This is not something small. The argument that different churches, we should have a contemporary service at 11 and a traditional at 8, and go to whichever one you're comfortable with, I think is an absurd argument, and one that cannot be backed up by Scripture. This isn't an issue that should come down to what you're comfortable with. Rather, it's an issue that comes down to which one actually affords God the respect and His holiness and His righteousness, the worthiness and the respect and the awe and the fear that it deserves, that He deserves. Which one actually does that? If it's neither of them, find yourself another church. I would either way. Any church that has a traditional and a contemporary service is begging the question, of what really do you care about here? What people's felt needs are, or what God commands? So I wouldn't go to a church like that. But I'm not going to tell anyone what to do, obviously. But these are things I think we need to think about seriously. And I don't see a lot of people really seriously thinking about this. We just kind of gloss over, oh, well, that was the Ark of the Covenant. That was what happened in those days, back in the days of the Israelites. This is the new covenant now. Christ has come. So everything's relaxed and chill now. No, I don't think so. I don't think that's how it is. The Lord's Supper, for example, they say that anyone that eats and drinks, I think it was Paul to the, never remember this, the Colossians maybe, or the Ephesians, one of those two. They were eating, if you eat and drink the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, you're eating and drinking judgment upon yourself. Very few pastors take the time to adequately explain what that means and do what's called a fencing of the Lord's Supper, so that the casual person in the pews who maybe has not made a profession of faith will think that, hey, they're just joining in, just like singing a hymn, they're just joining in with the rest of the congregation. And in the spirit of inclusiveness and they would think, doing what they ought, they would take the Lord's Supper, not realizing that they're reaping, that they're storing up judgment for themselves. Now, it's not an unpardonable sin, I don't believe, but no, it's not. But still, this is something that's deadly serious at the same time. So, anyway, that's our quick thought for the week. Next week, there'll be a longer episode. I'm going to break things up so that 1 week it's a quick thought episode, and then the next week it's a much more longer 45-minute treatment of a topic. So good night for this week, and God be with you.